technology. Thank you all for joining us today. Whether you're a startup founder, entrepreneur, business owner, marketeer, or someone passionate about understanding customer behaviour, we're delighted to have you with us. Today's session explores one of the most overlooked reasons why businesses succeed or struggle, not because of the quality of their products, but because of how customers make decisions. We often spend months improving products, refining pricing, and adding features, yet customers still hesitate to buy. And the question is, why? Today, we're going beyond traditional marketing to understand the psychology that drives every buying decision. By the end of this session, you'll understand why customers rarely buy logically, why trust often matters more than price, how successful companies like Apple, Netflix, Amazon, and Booking.com influence buying behaviour, and how founders can apply these principles to increase customer confidence and improve conversions. Throughout the session, we'll ask you a few questions to help you reflect on your own business. There's no need to answer in the chat unless you'd like to. We simply encourage you to think about how these ideas apply to your customers. We'll also have a dedicated Q&A session at the end, so if any questions come to mind during the presentation, feel free to note them down. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Amy Kohl is the founder of The Female Founder, a thriving community that supports women entrepreneurs through education, mentorship, networking, and business growth opportunities. She's also a startup advisor with LSET and has worked closely with founders across different industries, helping them understand customer behavior, marketing strategy, brand positioning, and sustainable business growth. Today, she'll share practical insights into why customers really buy, and more importantly, why they sometimes don't. Amy, thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Kelly. And hi, everyone, and thank you for being here today. I'm really excited about today's conversation because this isn't another webinar just about marketing tools or sales tactics. Instead, we're going to explore something much deeper, and that's the way that customers actually think. Every founder asks the same question, and that's how do I get more customers? But very few ask the much better question of what is happening inside my customer's mind before they decide whether to buy. And that's what we're going to uncover today. So throughout the session, I encourage you to think about your own business. Whenever I ask a question, you don't need to worry about responding immediately. You just need to ask yourself, how does this relate to my customers? Because by the end of today's webinar, I hope that you'll leave with a completely different perspective on customer behaviour. So let's get started. So inside the buyer's mind, we need to notice one important word in the title, the hidden psychology behind every buying decision, and that's hidden. Most founders see customer actions. Very few understand their customers' thoughts. You can see when someone's visiting your website or when they're clicking on your advertisement or even when they're adding a product to their shopping cart. But you can't immediately see what they're worried about, what they're comparing you against, and what uncertainty they're feeling, or finally, what convinces them to buy. So that's exactly what today's webinar is about. So we'll look beyond visible behaviour and explore the invisible psychological forces that influence every purchase. By understanding those forces, you'll begin making better business decisions, not by guessing what customers want, but by understanding why they behave the way that they do. So we'll start with one of the biggest misconceptions that lots of founders have, and that's that great businesses don't simply understand products, they understand their people. So let's begin with a statement that surprises many founders. Customers don't always buy the best product. They buy the product that feels the safest, the easiest, and the most valuable to them. So let's think about that for a moment. If the best product always won, then the company with the most advanced technology would dominate every single market. But that isn't always what happens. Sometimes a slightly simpler product wins, and sometimes even an expensive product wins, and sometimes an entirely unknown brand becomes successful. Why is that? And that's because people rarely buy based purely just on logic. In fact, psychologists estimate that the overwhelming majority of purchasing decisions begin subconsciously. The emotion comes first, and then the logic comes later. And our brains ask, does this feel right? Only afterwards do we begin creating logical reasons to justify the purchase. And that's why customers often say things like, it just felt like the right choice, or I just had a really good feeling about that company. And that's not always a logical explanation. They're the emotional decisions, and then supported later by the rational thinking. So before we continue, I'd like everyone to think about one simple question. Just think about it, you don't need to answer it out loud. What is the last expensive thing that you've personally bought? And what was your decision driven? Was it by pure logic, or did excitement, trust, brand reputation, or confidence play a role in that decision? Most of us realize that emotion influenced us far more than we actually expected it to. And that's exactly what your customers also experience. And the final sentence on this slide is probably my favorite, that people don't just buy products, they buy confidence in a decision. And that one sentence can completely change how founders approach sales and marketing. So instead of asking, how do I convince people? You need to start asking, how do I remove that uncertainty? So customers aren't always looking for that perfect product. They're looking for the safest decision.
Excellent. Thank you, Amy. I think that's already changing how many of us are thinking about buying decisions. I know I was reflecting on some of my own purchases while you were speaking. Now let's understand what actually happens during those first few moments when a customer evaluates a product.
Fab. So research suggests that customers begin forming impressions incredibly quickly, sometimes with only a few seconds. And during those first moments, they aren't analysing every single feature. Instead, their brain is silently asking 4 questions. The first question is, can I trust this? Does this company look credible? Does it feel reliable? Does everything from the testimonials from the website create confidence? And then the second question is, does this solve my problem? Customers aren't buying your product, they're hiring your product to solve a specific problem. If they don't immediately recognize that solution, they're going to just move on. The third is it worth the price? They don't always ask, is this cheap? They instead are asking, is this value greater than the cost of the product? And they're obviously 2 very different questions. And then finally, can I make this decision quickly? So if your buying process creates confusion, there's too many forms, too many options, or just too much uncertainty, customers delay that decision. And then delayed decisions often become lost sales. So I want you to notice something at the bottom of this slide. Most founders spend their marketing explaining their features, but customers spend their buying journey evaluating the risks. And that difference is obviously enormous. So when founders say, here's what our product does, customers are thinking, can I trust this company? So founders will explain the functionality and customers need to measure that confidence. And that's why understanding the psychology matters so much. So here's another quick question. If someone visited your website today, which of these 4 questions would be the hardest for you to answer? Would it be trust, problem solved, value, or the ease of decision? That answer often reveals the biggest opportunity to improve your conversions. Every customer buys only after answering one silent question. Does buying this feel less risky than not buying it? And once you understand that, your entire marketing strategy begins to change.
Thank you, Amy. That was an excellent foundation for today's discussion. We've learned that buying decisions are influenced far more by psychology than product specifications. Now that we understand how customers think, let's explore how founders can analyse one customer's behaviour and turn those insights into an entire target market. The next question naturally becomes, If every customer thinks differently, how do founders identify their ideal target market? Amy's now going to show us a practical framework that starts with just one customer and gradually builds an entire customer segment. Over to you, Amy.
Thank you. So one of the biggest mistakes that founders make is trying to sell to every single person. So you often hear founders say, our product is for everyone. Anyone can use it. Everyone's our customer. But in reality, if everyone's your customer, no one's your customer. Successful companies don't begin with millions of customers. They begin by deeply understanding one customer. So let's just imagine someone called Sarah. So Sarah works as a marketing manager in a SaaS company with around 30 employees. Every week, she spends hours manually creating reports. Her biggest frustration isn't the technology, it's about losing that valuable time on continuous repetitive work. So the important question is, as founders, should we immediately assume every marketing manager is our customer? No. Instead, we observe, we ask questions, we watch behaviour, we learn before we then scale. And that's what this first section of the slide actually teaches us. You need to start with one real life customer and not with all of your assumptions. So let's move on to the second section. So notice these customers' actions. Sarah downloads an ebook. She visits the pricing page 3 different times. She books a product demonstration, and then she spends time reading the reviews. And then finally, she purchases after seeing an ROI calculation. So most founders obviously see that activity. Great founders see the psychology behind it. So let's uncover each action. Downloading an ebook tells us that she's already aware of what her problem is. Visiting the pricing page repeatedly tells us that she's interested, but she's still evaluating the risk. Booking a demo tells us that she wants reassurance from someone. And then reading the reviews tells us that trust matters to her. And then buying only after seeing an ROI tells us something really valuable. She wasn't just buying the software, she was buying the confidence that this investment would produce measurable results. And that's behavioural analysis, not just looking at the demographics. Now imagine repeating this process with another 20, 30 customers. You start to notice patterns between all of them. Perhaps most of your customers are marketing managers, growth teams, they're working in SaaS businesses, they discover you through LinkedIn, they read customer reviews before purchasing, and then they ask for the demonstrations before making decisions. Now, those aren't random observations anymore. They're predictable buying behaviours, and predictable behaviours become your greatest business advantage. So bringing us on to the final section. Rather than saying our customers are businesses, we now define a very clear ideal customer profile. So for example, we're looking at marketing and growth teams. Those businesses are looking for automation and the companies that value saving time. So the buyers who they trust reviews and case studies, and the decision makers who prefer demonstrations before purchasing. And this profile becomes a foundation for everything in your business: marketing, sales, messaging, advertisements, websites, and even future product development. So I'd like everyone listening today to think about that one customer that you genuinely really enjoyed working with. It doesn't necessarily have to be your biggest or highest paying customer, just simply the customer who immediately understood your value. What behaviours did they have before they became a customer? And you'll often discover the beginning of your ideal customer profile. So before we move on, I'd like to leave you with a statement at the bottom of this slide because it just perfectly summarises today's lesson. One customer reveals a story, 20 similar customers reveal a pattern, and then that pattern becomes your ideal customer profile. So don't chase customers, just recognize the patterns that your customers already have given you.
Thank you, Amy. Particularly like the idea of successful businesses are built on recognizing patterns rather than making assumptions. Now let's see how one of the world's most valuable companies applies exactly this understanding of customer psychology.
Cool. So let's talk about Apple. So whenever Apple launches a new iPhone, something really interesting happens. So millions of people line up outside their stores. News channels cover the launch. Social media just completely explodes. So now let me ask you something. How many people buying the latest iPhone actually knows the specifications of that iPhone? How many knows how much RAM you're going to have, or know every hardware upgrade? Very few. I know I absolutely don't. And that's because Apple rarely talks about the technical specifications. Instead, Apple sells something way more powerful, and that's the lifestyle, the identity, the creativity, belonging, and that's status. So if you look at their advertisements, you usually see people creating films, running businesses, traveling, connecting with family, building ideas, but rarely do you see a commercial focus entirely on the memory size or the processor speed. And that's because Apple understands one important psychological truth. And that's what people buy who they become, not just what they receive. So owning an Apple product makes customers feel like they're creative, they're professional, they're modern, successful, innovative, and that's identity. And identity is often more powerful than the functionality of the product. So let's bring this back to startups. Suppose you're selling a project management software. So instead of saying we've got 15 reporting features, imagine saying we help your team finish products without bleeding into the weekend and creating stress. And both describe the same product, but one sells its features and the other one sells a better future. So people naturally connect with the second message. So if you think about your own business, if someone asked what feeling does this product create, could you answer it? And not just about what it does, but how it makes your customers feel. And that's often the missing piece in startup marketing. And that's the biggest lesson from Apple. And it's quite simple that people purchase identity before they purchase the functionality of it. So you need to stop asking yourself, how do I explain the features more? And instead, how do I make customers imagine a better version of themselves with this product?
That's such an interesting shift in perspective, Amy. Thank you. Instead of selling products, companies are often selling identities and aspirations. Our next example looks at another company that understands customer psychology exceptionally well, but in a completely different way.
So let's move from Apple onto Netflix. So Netflix doesn't simply just provide thousands of movies. In fact, that too many choices make it really hard to make a decision. But instead, Netflix says, here's what we think that you'll enjoy next. And that one sentence changes everything. So Netflix obviously understands something called decision fatigue, and I'm sure we've all experienced that at some point. The more options that we have, the harder it actually becomes to choose. So eventually people just choose nothing and they'll just move on. But Netflix removes that problem through personalization in their product. So every recommendation that they make says that we understand you. And that creates comfort, trust, and convenience. So let's move on to the psychology of this. So when customers feel understood, their confidence automatically increases. They don't waste 20 minutes searching, they just can start watching something. According to the statistics shown on this slide, more than 80% of Netflix viewing comes from those recommendations. And that means that the personalization isn't just a nice feature, it's actually one of the biggest drivers to customer engagement. So again, let's bring this back to startups. So you can say very easily, we offer 50 different services. And the response is usually, can your customer understand all 50 within 30 seconds? And that's probably not. So instead, you need to guide them, you need to recommend things, simplify the process, curate something for them. So rather than just displaying every single product equally, you need to highlight what's the most popular choice, or what's recommended specifically for you, or best for first-time founders, for example. And immediately you've reduced that mental effort. And customers appreciate businesses that help them decide and help them along their journey. So if you think about your own website, are you asking customers to make far too many decisions? Or are you making the decision really easy for them? Sometimes increasing conversions doesn't require adding loads more products to your business. It just requires reducing the choices that they make. So the lesson from Netflix is that one founder every should remember: customers don't want to make more choices, they just want better choices. The easier you make the buying journey, the more likely customers are to then complete it.
Thank you, Amy. We've now seen 3 powerful ideas. First, understand one customer deeply. Second, sell identity, not just functionality. And third, reduce decision fatigue instead of creating more choices. But even after doing all of that, customers still sometimes say no. We've seen how founders can identify their ideal customers, how Apple sells identity instead of specifications, and how Netflix removes decision fatigue. But despite doing everything right, customers still sometimes decide not to buy. Amy, why does that happen?
Yeah, so this is probably one of the most misunderstood areas in business. When founders lose a sale, the first assumption is our product's just too expensive. But in reality, the price is rarely the first reason why customers actually say no. So again, if you think about your own buying behavior, have you ever delayed buying something that you genuinely needed? And it's not just because of the price, but because you just simply weren't sure about it. So you might have wondered, is this the right solution? What if there's something better? Can I trust this company? What if I regret spending that money? And not all of those questions are about money purely. They're mainly about risk. And every purchase is ultimately a decision about risk. And that's why this slide highlights the real reasons customers hesitate. And that's, they don't buy because they experience uncertainty, confusion, lack of trust, no urgency, no social proof, and then just purely the fear of making the wrong decision. So notice something interesting. None of those reasons actually mention the product quality. Customers often reject uncertainty, not just the products.
So founders shouldn't immediately assume their pricing is a problem.
Yeah, exactly. So if someone says it's too expensive, I always encourage founders to ask, in comparison to what? Because sometimes customers don't mean I can't afford it. They just mean I don't yet understand why it's worth it. And that's obviously a huge difference. Price becomes a problem when they don't see the value and it's not obvious. So let's imagine 2 software companies. They both charge £99 a month. The first one says that they're an AI-powered productivity platform. And the second says, we save 5 hours every week by automating your reporting. It's the same price, but obviously a very different perception of what they do as a business. The second company reduces that uncertainty because the value of that £99 is immediately clear. So I'd like everyone to just have a really good think about this. If your customer says no to your product right now, what do you believe that they're actually saying no to? Is it the price or the timing, or they just simply aren't confident enough to say yes? And that answer could completely change your sales strategy. So customers don't buy when the risk feels higher than the reward. And as founders, our job is to reduce that perceived risk.
So if customers are constantly evaluating risk, how do successful businesses help customers feel more confident? Let's look at one company that has mastered this better than almost anyone else.
Yeah, so Booking.com. I'm sure almost everyone here has visited Booking.com at least once. And now I want you to remember what you actually see. So messages like there's only 2 rooms left, or booked 18 times today, or 5 people are currently reviewing this property. Have you ever wondered why those messages actually exist? And obviously they're not going to be there by accident. They're based on behavioral psychology. So let's look at the first one, scarcity. So when something appears limited, our brain immediately increases its perceived value. The second one is that social proof. So when we see that hundreds of other people have already booked something, our confidence is going to increase. We're going to naturally think, if so many people trust this, then perhaps like I should too. And then the third principle is urgency. The possibility of missing an opportunity often motivates us more than the possibility of gaining something. Psychologists call this loss aversion. So research consistently shows that people generally dislike losing something more than they enjoy winning. Booking.com doesn't force customers to buy. It just reminds them that waiting has those consequences.
So they're not creating demand, they're reducing hesitation.
Yeah, exactly. So they're helping customers make decisions faster by reducing that uncertainty. So imagine yourself selling a service. Instead of saying, contact us, you might say, this month's consultation slots are almost full, or more than 200 founders have already completed this program. Those statements don't necessarily pressure customers, they just provide context, and that context builds confidence. So if you take a moment to think about your own business, do you provide customers with enough reasons to trust you? Or are you expecting them to discover your credibility on their own? Remember that people fear missing those opportunities more than they enjoy finding them. And that's why urgency works when it's genuine and when it's ethical.
Excellent. So we've now explored trust and urgency, but buying decisions aren't simply logical processes, they're emotional journeys. Amy, let's look at what customers actually experience emotionally before they purchase.
Yeah. So, like you said, every purchase follows an emotional journey. So, let's work through this together. The journey usually begins with curiosity. A customer discovers your business, perhaps through LinkedIn or Google or a recommendation. And then there comes interest. Something captures their attention. And then next, they become hopeful. They begin imagining how your product could improve their work or they solve their problem. And then comes perhaps the most critical stage, and that's uncertainty. And this is where many businesses lose their customers. Questions start to appear like, can I trust them? Will this actually work? Should I compare another option first? And if founders successfully answer those concerns, customers move forward with confidence. Only then does the purchase happen. And then finally, after buying, customers evaluate whether their expectations were met. And that's either obviously satisfaction or disappointment.
So founders should understand where customers leave emotionally, not just technically.
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of founders analyze their website analytics, but very few actually analyze their customers' emotions. Sometimes people leave not because your website is poor, they just simply don't feel confident enough yet. So I want everyone to ask themselves this question. At which emotional stage do your customers usually disappear? Is it that curiosity, interest, uncertainty, or is it after purchasing? Understanding that can significantly improve your customer journey. Businesses don't tend to lose customers in just one moment. They lose them one emotion at a time.
So far, we've explored the psychology behind saying no. Let's finish today's case studies with a company that has built its entire customer experience around making buying feel effortless.
Yeah, fab. So let's finish those case studies with Amazon. So many people assume that Amazon dominates because it has the lowest prices, but that isn't necessarily always true. Many products on Amazon are actually available in several different places elsewhere. So why do people continue to choose Amazon? And that's because Amazon just completely removes that thinking. So let's consider what happens when you visit Amazon on the website. You immediately see product ratings, customer reviews, the delivery dates, recommended products, how easy the returns are, and then you've got that one-click purchasing process. Every single feature answers a question before the customers actually need to ask it. So the result is that customers spend less mental energy making those buying decisions. And whenever we reduce that mental effort, we increase the likelihood of action. Amazon understands something really important, and that convenience isn't just about the speed that it happens, it's about reducing that cognitive load.
So true. So success isn't simply about offering more products, it's about making those decisions easier.
Yeah, exactly. So if we take that back to your own business, does your customer have to think too much? Is there too many pricing options, too many forms, pages, or just generally just too many decisions? Every unnecessary decision increases the chance that customers just leave. And the easier you make the buying process, the easier the customer then just says yes. So here's one final question before we move into our workshop. If you remove just one step of your buying process tomorrow, which step would make life easier for your customers? Sometimes just removing that one unnecessary step improves the conversion way more than adding 5 new features to your product. So customers don't reward businesses that make them think harder. They reward the businesses that are obviously going to make their decisions easier.
Thank you, Amy. Those 4 case studies have shown us that understanding customer psychology isn't about manipulation, it's about reducing uncertainty, building trust, and making decisions easier. In our final section, Amy will introduce the key psychological triggers every founder should know, guide us through a practical customer mind analysis workshop, answer any questions that you might have, and leave us with some final insights you can immediately apply to your own business. Now let's bring everything together by exploring the psychological triggers that influence almost every buying decision.
Fab. So if you've got a notebook to hand, this page is probably where you're going to need to write the most notes. So these are the psychological triggers that successful companies use. And again, like Kelly said, not to manipulate those customers, but just to reduce that uncertainty and increase the confidence. So let's explore each one. So I can never say this word, reciprocatory. You're going to have to say that for me, Kelly. I can't say that word.
Reciprocity. Reciprocity.
There we go. But people naturally want to return to value. When a business gives something useful first, a helpful guide, a free consultation, a practical checklist, customers become more willing to engage further. So you need to notice that you're building goodwill before you're asking for a sale. Authority. So people trust expertise. Think about why those certifications, award, event speakers, industry recognitions actually matter. Authority tells customers that this company really knows what it's doing. And it's one reason why webinars like today are so valuable. Education builds a lot of credibility. Number 3, we're moving on to social proof. So people feel safer when they know others have already made the same decision. Customer reviews, testimonials, case studies, success stories, they're not just marketing tools, They're what's going to build a lot of confidence for your customers. So scarcity, this reminds customers, that opportunities aren't always available forever. So there's limited places, there's limited time, limited availability. But here's an important point. Scarcity should always be really genuine. We don't want artificial urgency because that just damages the trust. Number 5 is loss aversion. So psychologists have found that people generally dislike losing something more than they enjoy gaining something of equal value. And that's why messages like don't miss or prevent costly mistakes often resonate more strongly than gain new opportunities. 6 is commitment. So small commitments often lead to larger commitments. Downloading a guide, joining a webinar, booking a consultation. These small actions increase future engagement. Number 7 is anchoring. So customers rarely judge price just in isolation. They're going to compare. Showing different pricing options help customers evaluate the value more effectively. And number 8 is familiarity. My words are bumbling today. People trust businesses.
You know what you mean.
To recognize. And that's why consistent branding, consistent messaging, and regular communication actually does matter. Familiarity reduces uncertainty. As you're listening, I'd like you to ask yourself one question. Which of these psychological triggers does your business already use really well? And more importantly, which one of those are you actually overlooking? Psychology doesn't necessarily replace those great products. It just helps customers recognize that the great products they have with a lot greater confidence.
Now that we understand these psychological principles, let's apply them to a practical founder exercise.
So this is going to be my favorite part of today's webinar because it really shifts us from learning to actually thinking like a founder. So imagine that you have 3 customers. We've got customer A. They visit your website once, they read about your product, and then they purchase immediately. Why? And that's because they've probably had a really urgent problem. They have strong trust in your product and they've had a recommendation, or they were already looking for exactly the solution that you provide. Customer B visits your website 5 different times. They read your blogs, they check pricing repeatedly, and then they leave. What happens is usually uncertainty. So the questions that they had remained unanswered, and the confidence never reached the point where they could perform an action. And then customer C, they add your product to the cart, they almost complete the payment, and then they disappeared. And again, why? Was the delivery unclear? Did another competitor appear, or did the checkout process just become really complicated? Or did they just simply decide, I'll come back tomorrow? Founders often celebrate that initial traffic, but the great founders analyze the behavior once someone's on your website. So every customer does tell a story. The question is, are we actually listening to those customers? So this little exercise, so this week, I encourage each of you to choose 10 recent customers that you've had. And instead of just analyzing the revenue, how much they've bought, analyze their behavior. So you can literally ask them these questions up front. How did they discover you first? What questions did they have when they were buying? What nearly stopped them from buying? And then what finally convinced them? And you'll be amazed at the patterns that you actually uncover. So customer behavior always leaves clues, and the founders that actually study those clues become much stronger businesses.
Brilliant. What a helpful and incredibly practical exercise. Rather than guessing, you're encouraging founders to investigate, and that's a very powerful mindset.
Fab. So before today's webinar, many of us probably asked, how do I actually sell more? And I want to leave you with a very different question to ask yourself. And that's, how do I make buying easier? Because that's where psychology meets your business. Customers don't wake up wanting just another product. They wake up wanting fewer problems, as we all do. If your business helps them make a confident decision, you've already won half the battle. So remember today's key lessons. Customers buy confidence, they buy clarity, and they buy trust. Remove that confusion, reduce the risk, and make that decision process really simple. And your business will become significantly easier to buy from. Like I said at the beginning, customers rarely just reject the product. They're going to reject that uncertainty. So the founder who removes that uncertainty earns both the trust and then eventually the revenue.
Thank you, Amy. That really brings today's discussion together beautifully. Before we conclude, though, let's answer a few questions that founders commonly ask. So, Amy, if customers buy emotionally, should founders stop talking about product features completely?
No, not at all. So the features still obviously matter. The features just should support the emotions and not necessarily replace them. So emotion obviously starts the buying process, but as we've mentioned, the logic finishes it. So you need to explain how your product is going to change a customer's life and then explain how it works and how it's going to do that.
Excellent. And what's the biggest mistake startups make when trying to increase sales?
I think it's about where they try to convince the customers rather than spending the time to actually understand them. The best founders spend less time consistently selling, but they spend a lot more time actually listening to their customers.
Excellent, thank you. And so another one for you, how can small startups compete with well-known brands?
They need to build trust faster. So the large companies obviously have that huge recognition, but startups have a lot of authenticity. So use customer success stories, transparent communication, and that educational content to reduce that uncertainty faster.
And I guess as well, smaller companies are more accessible, aren't they? And something that they can use to their advantage. So how often should founders review their customer behaviour?
Definitely every month. So the customer expectations constantly change all the time. And obviously, if your customers are constantly evolving, you need to understand that evolution as well. So yeah, definitely every month.
Okay. And if you had to choose between one of these, what's more important, price or trust?
Definitely trust. So customers are willing to pay more sometimes when they believe that they're making a safer decision.
Excellent. And if there's one thing founders should improve this week, what would you recommend?
I think go and speak to 5 customers that you have. There's absolutely no harm in asking what almost stopped you from buying. And those answers are going to improve your business way more than another advertising campaign.
Yeah, and 5 customers is a very manageable amount, isn't it? And could save you some time. So finally then, if you had to summarise today's webinar in one sentence, what would it be?
So I think that businesses really need to understand customer psychology, and that doesn't mean that they just win more sales. They're going to build those stronger relationships, lasting trust, and essentially sustainable growth in their business.
Brilliant. Thank you, Amy. And before we close, I'd also like to introduce an opportunity for founders who want to continue building and growing their businesses.
Cool. So obviously today's webinar introduced powerful ideas, but understanding that customer psychology is only one part of building a really successful startup. So the LSET Startup Incubator supports founders through mentorship, expert guidance, business validation, networking, and practical learning designed to turn those initial ideas into really scalable businesses. So if you are serious about accelerating your entrepreneurial journey, I really encourage you to explore the program. You can scan the QR code or visit the LSET website. So then your learning doesn't just stop today, it's a continuous journey.
Excellent. Thank you, Amy. Well, everyone, That brings us to the end of today's webinar. On behalf of the London School of Emerging Technology, thank you for joining us. And Amy, thank you for sharing with us such valuable insights and practical examples.
Thank you so much, Kelly. And thank you to everyone who's joined today. And I really hope to leave you one simple shift in perspective, that you don't need to improve your product. You need to improve your customers' confidence in choosing that product. And the founders who understand this will always outperform those who only focus on the products. So thank you so much. And I wish everyone so much success in their entrepreneurial journey.
Brilliant. Thank you once again, Amy. And thank you to everyone who's joined us live or watching later. We hope to see you again in one of our upcoming LSET webinars. Until then, keep learning, keep experimenting, and always stay curious about your customers. Have a wonderful day and goodbye.